Unordinary Times. Families divided, strangers united. Unordinary times. We live in unordinary times, don't we? In fact, the other day I saw a great article by The Onion. The title of it, and remember this is a satirical magazine, the title of it was "Country in Phase 4 of Pretending Coronavirus is Over." And I laughed when I saw that because clearly, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. Even though businesses have opened across the country and the economy has restarted mostly, there have been over 115,000 people that have died of this virus and over 2 million infected in our country alone. And then there's the social unrest. This week, another incident of racial division occurred in the country and was amplified during an escalation between police and a man that was passed out in an Atlanta Wendy's parking lot. And that has led to further protests in the country, protests that were still going strong in the wake of George Floyd's killing by MPD and has been rekindled by the death now of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. All of this is to say is that we live in a time of the pandemic of disease and the pandemic of injustice, one with divided families and one with united strangers. Today I want to talk a little bit about this because I think our scriptures actually speak to many of the situations we find ourselves living in today. And the words of God in Genesis and the words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel shed light on how we as Christians might be called to make sense of the pandemics of injustice and of disease that we find ourselves living in today. So to begin, our Old Testament lesson today comes from Genesis. I've said this before, but Genesis is a book of beginnings. The beginning of the universe, the beginning of humanity, the beginning of families and tribes in the Bible, and the rise of the nations and eventually of Israel. Last week we heard from the saga of Abraham and Sarah, and these are two ancestors of our faith. And we heard about their unexpected hospitality toward three strangers that basically end up being the voice of God in the story. They deliver to them a message from God that Sarah, in her old age, will have a child to her elderly husband. She laughed at the unexpected news, and she was floored when in due time she did, in fact, bear a child, a son, Isaac, his name meaning laughter. All of this seems pretty rosy. It seems like a fun story. It's one that is uplifting to us. But then we come to this week, a continuation of the Genesis story from last week. Although Sarah had a child of her own, she had Isaac, she became protective of Isaac, and she became dismissive of the first son that was a part of her family. And when I say that, you might not know what I'm talking about. You see, Sarah had a slave girl. Her slave, her servant, however we want to clean that language up, was named Hagar. And Hagar had a son to Abraham. So in a sense, they have this family where the slave girl has a son to her husband, okay? And that slave girl's son's name is Ishmael. When Sarah sees her own flesh and blood child, Isaac, and Ishmael playing together, Sarah gets upset. And she tells Abraham to dismiss the slave, to send Hagar away, to send her and her son out into the wilderness. And this would mean certain death. Okay? Abraham listens to his wife. He sends Hagar and Ishmael away based on her assumptions of what was going on and her own securities. He sends her away. She was in a position of power, and she wielded that power like a weapon. Memorial Day is normally a day when we would remember our national heroes, and we'd give thanks for their lives. It's also a time for grilling and chilling. But this year it was a little bit different for many people in our country as we were locked down at home for the most part. And instead of spending time with our friends and family, we were sitting in front of computers and TVs. And this year it became kind of a catalyst for talking about race and white privilege as we found ourselves hunkered down in the middle of the pandemic. Christian Cooper is a name that you may have heard in most recent weeks. Christian Cooper is an African-American man. He began his Memorial Day like most of his May mornings. He would go birding in Central Park, New York. He'd bike 3 miles to the Ramble, which is kind of this unoccupied, semi-wild section of the park, where he would go bird watching for scarlet tanagers and blackbirds with his binoculars. Around the same time, we hear Amy Cooper, white woman, unrelated to Christian Cooper, left her apartment with her dog, Henry, a Cocker Spaniel that has his own dedicated Instagram account. In the ramble, the two Coopers would have their lives crash together. Christian Cooper noticed that Amy Cooper did not have her dog on the leash. She was breaking the rules. He asked her kindly to leash Henry, and an exchange between the two escalated when she refused to comply with the request. She decided that instead of complying and putting the dog on a leash, that she would use her position and power in society as a white woman as a weapon. In an ephemeral exchange that was recorded that would shake New York City and reverberate across the United States during conversations on race and hypocrisy and privilege, Amy Cooper called police on Christian Cooper. While Christian recorded him with his cell phone, Amy told the police that she was being assaulted by a black man, which clearly was not true. She whipped up tears and knew exactly what to say to incriminate him. And all of it was caught on camera. She knew that his side would not be taken, wielding her power and privilege like a weapon. Since this exchange occurred and was recorded and shared virally all over the internet, the tables have been turned on Amy, now dubbed the Central Park Karen for her antics. If it had not been recorded, however, things may have gone a very different way. This, in a sense, and why I'm sharing this with you, is what takes place in the Genesis story today when Sarah, upset about Ishmael and Isaac playing together, tells her husband what she needs him to hear to have him send Hagar and Ishmael out and away into certain death. Hagar has been sent out into the wilderness without any water with her baby boy. She places her son under a tree, pleads for God to take her life. But God, hearing the voice of the child and Hagar's pleas and prayers, speaks to her, tells her not to be afraid, promises to make a great nation of him, and delivers them to a new home despite the injustice that had been done to them. God was with them, with Ishmael and Hagar. God sides with the oppressed, and God is not with those who are in the positions of power, but is with those that find themselves on the margins, on the receiving end of those in positions of power. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. In the gospel lesson from Matthew today, Jesus teaches his followers what it means to follow him. He tells them that the disciples are not above the teacher, but people will treat you the same as the teacher regardless, calling you names, hating you because you are his disciple. Jesus tells them, like God tells Hagar in the story from Genesis, not to be afraid. The truth will be told. They must continue to teach and share what he has empowered them to do, even if they're hated by others. God loves them, and God will be with them, and God will hold them steady. Jesus continues by telling his disciples that he hasn't come to bring peace, but a sword, that his words will bring division. Tough words from both scriptures. We live in highly divided times. Everything seems politicized during this election season, from public health advice about face masks to the use of police force, to the removal of monuments and Confederate flags, to conversations about race and privilege and more. I think the words of Jesus that he didn't come to bring peace, but to bring the sword, not to bring unity, but to bring division, is really hard to hear because we don't think it sounds like Jesus. But in actuality, it's really the most Jesus-y thing ever in these divided times we find ourselves in today. Because those of us that want to leverage our power and privilege, or want to hold on to power, might find ourselves on the wrong side of history, on the opposite side of the moral arc of the universe, or with Jesus flipping over a table on us. The fact that Jesus says he hasn't come to bring peace, but a sword, speaks a lot to our situation today. As families and friends have basically broken up over our inability to have honest and open conversations about race, politics, economics, and more. And it says a lot about the people who are finding themselves united today. Strangers uniting to say enough is enough through prayer walks, peaceful protests, social and civil unrest. If we are comfortable being like the Central Park Karen or Sarah on the wrong side of God's justice, then Jesus' sword might be for us. We must decide if we wish to follow him, or whether we are willing to risk losing everything, including our lives, to follow Jesus. Or if we are only paying lip service to God that we've made in our own image. Jesus concludes by saying, those who hold on to the ways of the world will lose, but those who risk losing their life for him will find their own lives. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. Friends, again I say, we find ourselves living in unordinary times. But for some in our country, things are too ordinary. They've been like this for a long, long time. The pandemics of COVID-19 and of systemic racism are both deadly. Jesus calls us to combat both the best we can. But the journey will not be easy. We may find our friends and families divided or even against us as we have tough conversations. We may find ourselves like Hagar, wanting to give up and die, or like the disciples, on the receiving end of threats and anger and hate for following the way of Christ and doing justice in the world. But as with Hagar and Ishmael and the disciples, God promises to stand alongside us during these unordinary times of division. And so my prayer for you is that you might really think this week about what it means to follow the way of Jesus, to walk in his footsteps. What do you think he means when he tells us he's not coming to bring peace, but to bring the sword? How have you used peace to disrupt difficult conversations and growth from taking place? How might you be able to lean into the discomfort of that sword Jesus talks about to confront racism in your own families, among your friends, or even in your own heart? We all, and this is myself included, have difficult work to do. So I pray this week we can get to work, that we can continue to do the difficult work of justice, of learning in the midst of two pandemics that we find ourselves deeply steeped in today. May it be so, my friends. May it be so. Amen? Amen.